The scent of grilled chicken had settled into my sweater by the time the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows across our backyard. It was one of those casual evenings that felt more like a habit than a celebration. Josh had invited a handful of his tennis club friends over, and their wives had come too, though most of us didn't really know each other beyond a few polite smiles exchanged at past events. The kids ran in and out of the house. The patio table was covered with mismatched plates and condensation-ringed wine glasses, and someone had brought a portable speaker that kept cutting in and out with half-played songs from an old playlist. I was at the grill, focused on turning the chicken just right so it didn't dry out, when I felt the familiar buzz of my phone in my back pocket. It was instinctive to check it, more from habit than urgency, and I glanced at the screen, expecting another school notification or a group text from the neighborhood moms. Instead, it was a message from Mark, Josh's boss, a man I'd spoken to only a handful of times at company barbecues and holiday events. Always in the polite, vaguely formal tone people use when they don't know what else to say to someone's spouse. The message read, "You're incredibly thoughtful. Not many like you anymore." That was it. No punctuation flourishes, no emojis, no obvious subtext, and yet it landed in me with a quiet thud, like a book falling closed in another room. Small, distant, but impossible to ignore once you heard it. I didn't react right away. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned back to the grill, but the message settled into me like warm water soaking through fabric. It wasn't overtly inappropriate, not even slightly suggestive, and still, I felt something shift. Not in the air around me, but somewhere internal, like I had walked into a room I hadn't realized I missed. Later that night, after most of the guests had wandered home and the kids were finally upstairs, I found myself drying glasses next to Lauren in the kitchen while Josh fiddled with the Bluetooth speaker that still wouldn't shut off. Told her about the message in that offhand way you bring up something you don't fully understand yourself, and she paused only for a second before giving me a look. That slightly raised eyebrow she reserves for things she finds amusing rather than alarming. She said, "That's a weird thing for your husband's boss to say," but her voice didn't carry concern, just curiosity, like she was noting a headline in a newspaper she had no plans to finish reading. I told her I didn't think it meant anything, and she didn't argue. She just smiled that knowing half-smile she has and said, "You smiled when you read it," before tossing the dish towel onto the counter and walking back out to the patio, without waiting for a reply. Josh came into the kitchen a few seconds later, holding a half-empty bowl of chips and asking if we had any salsa left, and I answered without really hearing the question. I don't think he noticed. That night, when we finally climbed into bed and the house had gone still in that way it only does after a long evening of forced social cheer, I opened my phone again and read the message once more. I didn't respond. I didn't even consider it, really. But I also didn't delete it. Instead, I let it sit there, glowing faintly in the dark, as if the words themselves were still unfolding in my mind, looking for a place to land. It wasn't about Mark, not exactly. It was about the fact that someone had seen me and said something, and I had felt it in a place I hadn't known was empty until that moment. It wasn't romantic, and it wasn't a threat. But it was something. And it stayed. Eventually, sometime past midnight, I deleted the message. Not because I was afraid of Josh seeing it, or because I thought I'd done anything wrong, but because I knew I would keep reading it if I didn't. It had already done whatever it came to do. I didn't want it to become a seed that grew into something I couldn't control. The next morning, Josh brewed coffee while I pretended to scroll through recipes for the week, my phone resting next to me on the counter, clean of any trace of last night's stir. He was reading news headlines aloud and asking if I'd remembered to RSVP for the school fundraiser, and I answered when I had to, keeping my voice steady and light. But my mind, against my better judgment, kept circling back to Mark and his unexpected sentence, wondering whether it had come from a place of impulse or intent, and why, of all the people at that table last night, he'd chosen to send it to me. It's strange, the way one quiet message can make the rest of the noise in your life sound suddenly different. Not louder, just less relevant. And even stranger how, once something like that is heard, it can't be unheard, no matter how much you wish it could be. 3 days later, I stopped by the bakery on Maple, the one with the uneven floor tiles and the crooked, little chalkboard sign out front that always made the same joke about carbs not counting on weekends. I was there to pick up a pecan pie for a school fundraiser, something I'd agreed to donate weeks ago and completely forgotten, until that morning when the reminder popped up on my calendar between laundry and call pest control. I was in yoga pants and hadn't even brushed my hair, just thrown on a sweatshirt and hoped no one would notice me. I was standing in line behind a woman asking too many questions about gluten when I heard someone say my name. It was Mark. He was standing by the fridge with the bottled drinks, holding a cappuccino and a small bag of what looked like banana bread. He wasn't in a suit, which was the first strange thing. Just jeans and a navy zip-up that made him look more like someone on his way to coach soccer practice than someone who usually delivered quarterly updates to a boardroom full of people who wore watches they didn't need to check. I nodded, polite, but a little surprised, and he walked over like it wasn't the least bit unusual to see me there. He asked if I was picking something up for the kids, and I explained the school event, mentioned the pie, said it all too quickly, like I needed him to know there was a reason for me being there that had nothing to do with him. But he didn't make anything awkward. He just nodded and smiled like we were both neighbors catching up on the sidewalk and started talking about the school itself, how his niece used to go there, how the fundraiser used to be smaller, how people always underestimated how much energy kids could pour into a bake sale when they were promised a pizza party. I don't remember responding to any of it directly. I just remember thinking how strange it was that I didn't feel like I had to keep looking at my phone or pretending I had somewhere else to be. At one point, we both stepped aside for a woman balancing 3 boxes of croissants, and our arms brushed. Nothing intentional, just one of those tiny contacts that you'd forget if you didn't already have a reason to notice it. He asked me if I ever came by here on weekends. The question was casual, soft, almost buried in the conversation, like he was slipping it in as a footnote to something larger. I just raised an eyebrow slightly, unsure if it was really a question or just a statement dressed up as one. He smiled again, not smug, not expectant, and said that he usually came by Saturday mornings around 9, got a coffee, and sat outside with a paper before the place filled up with too many people asking about almond milk. I could have said something then. I could have made a joke, or answered in a way that closed the door. But I didn't. I nodded like I'd heard him, then looked down at my phone and pretended to read a notification that wasn't there. When the pie was ready, I paid and waved goodbye. He said something about seeing me around, and I didn't correct him. I walked back to the car with the pie balanced on one hand and my thoughts in the other, heavy and awkward. I sat there for a while before driving off, watching the glass door of the bakery, half expecting him to come out and look around, but he didn't. He stayed inside. Or maybe he left a different way. I didn't know, and that felt like something I wasn't sure I wanted to care about. That night, while folding laundry and half listening to Josh explain something about restructuring at his office, Mark's idea, mostly, I nodded at all the right times and realized I'd spent more mental energy that day replaying a 10-minute conversation at a bakery than anything else that had actually happened. I told myself it was nothing, a coincidence, a man being polite. But part of me knew that people don't say things like, "Not many like you anymore," and then show up in your path without some part of it being intentional. Maybe not fully planned. Maybe not even conscious. 2 days after the bakery, I went back. Not because I had another pie to pick up, and not because I was curious, at least that's what I told myself, but because I had time to kill between errands. And it was close. And I remembered they had that cinnamon bread Josh used to like before he decided carbs were the enemy. It was just after 9. I told myself I was running late. Told myself if Mark happened to be there, it was just luck. But when I walked in and saw him at the corner table by the window, reading a folded newspaper like it was 1998, I felt that tiny, involuntary flicker in my chest I hadn't felt in years, the kind that doesn't feel like happiness, just a strange, sharp awareness that you're not in control of the next 10 minutes. He looked up, smiled like he'd been expecting me, and pushed out the chair across from him with the side of his foot. I sat down. We didn't talk about work, not his, not Josh's, not mine, which lately barely felt like mine anymore. We talked about books and how neither of us finished them anymore, just skimmed and made notes in the margins and promised ourselves we'd go back and read it properly later. We talked about how exhausting school fundraisers were, and how Lauren was always at the center of them, and how people like her made you feel lazy for just showing up with a pie. After 20 minutes of drifting between topics, he asked me a question that didn't match the mood at all, like a needle dropped on the wrong part of the record. He leaned forward a little and said, "When was the last time you did something just for yourself?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at the wall behind him, at a framed poster advertising biscotti and locally roasted beans. I could feel my body still, as if answering too fast would make something visible I didn't want noticed. The question itself wasn't offensive. It wasn't even that personal. But it landed differently. Like someone had opened a door I hadn't realized was locked. I eventually gave a vague answer. Something about a yoga class I went to last month. He didn't press. Just nodded like he knew it wasn't true and didn't need it to be. And the strange part was that he wasn't trying to make a point, or push a boundary, or flirt. It was the kind of question people ask when they already know the answer and are just wondering if you'll say it out loud. I left not long after. Told him I had to pick something up before lunch. He didn't try to extend it or say we should do it again. Just said, "It was nice talking," and went back to his paper like we'd simply paused and might resume whenever the next coincidence allowed it. That night, after dinner, Josh was going over numbers on his laptop, mumbling something about staff turnover and margins. I was sitting on the couch, staring out the window at nothing, and all I could think about was that question. When was the last time you did something just for yourself? It echoed, but not like a romantic memory or a line from a movie. It echoed like something you'd been trying not to think about for years finally being said out loud. Like your brain recognized it before your heart did. I went to bed before Josh. Didn't bother brushing my hair or even turning off the light in the hallway. I lay there with my phone in hand, not texting anyone, not reading anything. Just thinking about how strange it was to be seen by someone who didn't know my routines, my habits, my schedules. How different it felt when someone noticed something inside you instead of what you handled on the outside. The next morning, the air in the house felt heavier, though not because of anything specific that had happened. Josh was home for once, a rarity lately, and had set up his laptop at the kitchen table, surrounded by open folders, 2 coffee mugs, and a half-eaten protein bar he kept forgetting to finish. He was in a good mood, or at least what passed, for a good mood with him these days, talking quickly, describing the internal changes at his office with a kind of distracted enthusiasm that made me feel like I was supposed to be impressed, even though I didn't really understand half of what he was saying. He kept referring to automation processes, department realignments, and something called agile transition mapping, which might as well have been a different language. I nodded where I thought I was supposed to nod, occasionally asking a question just to make it look like I was keeping up, but the truth was I wasn't listening. Not really. I was physically present, sitting across from him with my hand loosely wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold 10 minutes earlier. But in my head, I was somewhere else entirely. My eyes kept drifting toward the kitchen window, where the morning light stretched across the countertop in long, slow-moving lines, and I found myself focusing on the shapes they made rather than on Josh's voice. It wasn't a conscious choice. More like my brain had quietly decided it couldn't be here anymore and had slipped away without asking permission. At some point, he mentioned Mark, not by name at first, but by referencing a leadership decision that upper management had supported, and I felt something flicker inside me. Not guilt exactly, and not fear either, but a kind of quiet internal jolt that reminded me how close the two worlds I was now balancing really were. He kept talking, flipping open a new spreadsheet and adjusting his glasses the way he always did when he was about to make a point he thought was particularly important, and I kept nodding, though I could barely hear him anymore. In that moment, what struck me wasn't anything he was saying, but the realization that I hadn't thought about what he was saying, not deeply, not genuinely, in weeks. It hit me then, as I sat across from him in the same room where we'd planned vacations and picked out wallpaper samples, and once stayed up until 3 a.m. arguing over what kind of stroller to buy, that I no longer knew where I fit in the story of my own life. Somewhere along the way, I had become the person who kept the schedule running, who sent the emails, who made sure the pantry was stocked and the forms were signed, and I hadn't noticed the quiet erosion of anything beyond that. I had become a function, not a person. I had learned to operate efficiently and invisibly, like background music in a coffee shop. Always there, never noticed unless it stopped. Josh closed his laptop for a moment, leaned back in his chair, and said something about needing to cut out early for a meeting downtown, and I said, "Sure, of course, no problem." He smiled, that familiar, polite smile he gave when he was already thinking about his next call, and kissed me on the side of the head without really looking at me. As he walked out of the room, I stayed seated, staring at the spot where his coffee cup had left a faint ring on the wood. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. It was something more complicated, Like stepping into a room you hadn't been in for years and realizing the furniture was exactly the same, but you had outgrown every piece of it. That was the moment I knew something was shifting inside. Me, slowly but undeniably. Not because Mark had said anything new, or because Josh had done anything wrong, but because I could no longer ignore the question that had been hovering at the edge of my consciousness since that morning in the bakery. Where am I in all of this? And the worst part was that I didn't have an answer. Not even a false one to hold on to for comfort. The school fundraiser was held in the sprawling event space behind the sports complex, the kind of venue that smelled faintly of disinfectant, and old gym mats no matter how many fairy lights you strung across the ceiling. I had volunteered to help at the raffle table, but ended up spending most of my time standing near the lemonade station, stirring the same plastic cup with a flimsy straw and pretending to be busy checking inventory on my phone. The room was filled with the usual noise, clinks of plastic cups, polite laughter, someone trying to connect a playlist to the speakers without success. But underneath all of that was something harder to name, something quieter and colder, that had settled around me without asking permission. I was mid-scroll through an email thread I had no real interest in when Lauren appeared beside me. She wasn't holding a drink, wasn't looking around the room, wasn't performing the polite, distracted enthusiasm that everyone else had perfected for nights like these. She just stood there for a moment, watching me stir my watered-down lemonade like she was waiting for something to surface. Then, without warning or any build-up at all, she said, "Did you know Josh has been working 12-hour days for the past 2 years, and it's not just because he's busy?" I blinked, trying to catch up to the shift in tone. What's that supposed to mean? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and gave me the kind of look people usually save for when they're about to give you a piece of information they know you won't be able to forget. Then she said, "Sometimes it helps to look a little wider than you have been." It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't cruel. If anything, it sounded almost like a favor, like she was offering me a shortcut to something painful so I wouldn't have to stumble into it blindly later. But that didn't soften the blow. In fact, it made it worse. Because Lauren wasn't a dramatic person. She didn't stir the pot for fun. And if she was saying something like this, it meant she wasn't just speculating. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't think of a single sentence that didn't sound either naive or defensive. She stayed for a moment longer, then gave me the faintest nod, almost like a bow, and walked off toward the silent auction table where 2 moms were arguing over who had bid on the wine-tasting gift basket first. I stood there alone, still holding that same useless cup, and realized my hand was shaking slightly. For the rest of the evening, I moved through the crowd like I was watching it from the outside. I smiled when people approached me. I laughed at a joke about PTA drama. I accepted a thank you from a teacher who didn't remember my name, but none of it touched me. I felt like I had drifted 10 feet off the ground and was watching my life continue on autopilot while something far more urgent unfolded just below the surface. Josh arrived toward the end of the event, still in his work clothes, phone in hand. The knot of his tie loosened just enough to suggest effort but not fatigue. He kissed me on the cheek and thanked me for covering the early shift, and I smiled and asked him how his meeting went. Like nothing was wrong. Like Lauren hadn't just handed me a small, heavy box with no return address. He talked about logistics and feedback and a new system they were implementing, and I nodded, already thinking about how many details I'd missed over the past 2 years, simply because I hadn't been looking for them. On the drive home, I stared out the passenger window and thought about all the things that didn't make sense anymore. The nights he stayed late without sending a single message, the vague answers to simple questions, the way he'd grown more polite and less present in ways I had quietly accepted because it was easier than asking why. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I found myself wondering what else I hadn't seen or hadn't wanted to. The next morning, I stared at my phone for longer than I should have. The kitchen was quiet, the coffee machine blinking its idle green light, and Josh had already left for an early meeting without saying much beyond a quick, "See you later," from the hallway. I stood in front of the window with the half-drawn curtains, holding my phone like it weighed more than it should. There wasn't a plan. I didn't write a draft first, didn't even think of what I wanted to say. I just opened the message thread with Mark and typed something vague about a work-related idea, something about a volunteer project he'd mentioned during that first long conversation at the bakery, and hit send before I could convince myself not to. He responded a few minutes later, his reply casual, easy, and open-ended. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing that could be misread on paper. but the tone was unmistakably personal, familiar in a way that most people would have missed, if they weren't already attuned to the space between words. He suggested we meet in the park near the duck pond, the one tucked behind the neighborhood walking trail, where people walked their dogs in the early hours and usually disappeared before the sun got too high. I told him that worked for me. Parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, pretending that I'd just decided to take a walk that morning, pretending it was all spontaneous, pretending I hadn't planned everything down to what sweater I wore. When I reached the park, the path was mostly empty. The trees cast slow-moving shadows over the pavement, and the pond was still, with only a few ducks drifting toward the reeds. Mark was already there, sitting on a bench with a coffee in one hand and sunglasses pushed up into his hair, like he'd just come from a jog he hadn't actually taken. When he saw me, he stood up without saying anything and waited for me to walk the rest of the way. We didn't shake hands. We didn't hug. We just started walking, slowly, without direction or urgency, following the curve of the path around the pond like we both needed the motion to carry us through the silence. I think we both knew we weren't here to talk about the project. Eventually, he asked how I'd been. I gave the kind of answer you give when you're not sure what the real one is anymore. Something between fine and tired, but coated with enough smile to make it sound harmless. He didn't push. He just nodded and told me the trees would be bare soon, that he always hated this part of fall, the part where everything felt like it was waiting to be dead. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true in a way that I wasn't expecting. We walked a little further. We didn't talk much. And then, just before we reached the corner of the path where the trees broke open toward the parking lot, I stopped to tie my shoelace, or maybe I just needed to stop walking. And when I stood back up, he was looking at me like he was waiting for something I hadn't said out loud yet. He reached for my hand, not fully, not with purpose, just enough to let his fingers brush against mine. It was barely a touch, nothing cinematic, nothing big. But it was steady, and it was deliberate. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone understood exactly where I was. Not in a general sense, not with sympathy or curiosity, but with quiet, terrifying clarity. He leaned forward and kissed me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't careful either. It was just there, slow, measured, quiet, like it had already happened in both of our heads long before this moment ever arrived. There were no promises in it. No talk of what came next. No apologies, no declarations. Just the kind of silence that says everything else has already been said. When it was over, we stood there for a second, still facing each other but not really looking anymore. Then I stepped back, nodded slightly, not as an answer but as a thank you, and turned toward the exit path without waiting for him to follow. I didn't look back. All the way home, my hands stayed loose on the steering wheel, my heart calm, my thoughts strangely clear. I wasn't thinking about consequences or timelines or guilt. I was thinking about how little it had taken to feel like I existed again. It didn't happen all at once, the change in the way Josh looked at me. It came slowly, in glances that lasted a little too long and in silences that stretched just a little too wide, like he was trying to piece something together but wasn't ready to ask outright. He didn't accuse me of anything, not directly, and he didn't change his routine in any obvious way. He still left early for work, still came home late, still put his keys in the same dish by the door, and took off his shoes near the stairs, like he always had. But there was a new edge to his movements, a tension just beneath the surface that didn't match anything he said aloud. He was watching me. Not constantly, not obsessively, but in that quiet, practiced way people watch when they already suspect something, and are simply waiting for the proof to show up in plain sight. He started noticing things he hadn't paid attention to in years, the way I changed my perfume one morning, the fact that I took longer routes when I walked the dog, the way I started leaving the house in gym clothes but came back without any sign I'd actually worked out. He never said anything accusatory, but his comments were changing. One morning he paused in the hallway while buttoning his shirt and said, "You've been getting up early lately." And though he said it like a compliment, I could hear the question buried inside it. A few days later, as I was leaving with a grocery list in one hand and my phone in the other, he said, "You seem more put together these days." And even though he smiled after saying it, his eyes didn't match the smile. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was paying attention. Then, one evening, we were sitting at the dining table with our plates between us, half full and already cooling, the hum of the dishwasher in the background the only sound in the room, when he looked at me, really looked, and said, "You've changed this month. You seem somewhere else." His tone wasn't hurt. It wasn't sharp. It was cautious, like he was laying down the words one by one across a frozen lake, testing the weight before taking the next step. I held his gaze for a second, tried to think of something light to say, something that would make the moment pass without lingering, but I couldn't lie well enough anymore to keep the truth entirely buried. "I've just been thinking more," I said finally, which wasn't a lie but also wasn't the whole truth, and we both knew it. He nodded slowly, then leaned back in his chair like he was trying to make sense of something that had already stopped making sense a while ago. Later that night, as we stood side by side at the bathroom sinks, brushing our teeth and pretending not to notice the silence between us, he mentioned, almost casually, that he had received a formal letter of promotion. I paused, toothpaste still in my mouth, and looked at him in the mirror. He didn't look excited or proud, just tired. "Mark was the first to sign off," he said after a moment, voice low, almost detached, as if the name itself was a thread. He was laying on the table to see how I'd react. I forced myself to nod and said, "That's great," but the words tasted wrong, and not because of the mint. There it was, the connection I hadn't expected him to notice, the thread I thought I'd hidden well enough beneath errands and polite conversation. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I held my expression steady, not because I was good at hiding things, but because I was suddenly aware of how far apart we drifted without realizing it. He didn't press further. He didn't accuse me of anything, didn't demand to see my phone or ask me where I'd been that morning. He just rinsed his toothbrush, wiped his mouth with a towel, and walked out of the room. I stood there for a long time, staring into the mirror, wondering if it was worse to be found out, or worse to be given the space to come clean and still say nothing. The silence in the house was different now. Not the comfortable, lived-in quiet of a couple who no longer needed to fill every moment with conversation, but the distant, careful quiet of two people who were slowly becoming strangers again. One day at a time, and were too polite or too afraid to admit it out loud. And in that silence, I started to understand something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. It wasn't just about what I had done, or what I hadn't said. It was about the fact that I had started answering questions that Josh no longer knew to ask. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that blends into all the others unless something tears it apart from the inside. I had driven across town to drop off dry cleaning and pick up new running shoes I didn't really need, and on the way back I stopped by the bakery, not for any real reason, or at least not one I was willing to name. I told myself it was out of habit, that I wanted a scone, or that I needed a moment alone before returning to the dull rhythm of errands and grocery lists. But the truth was simpler and more complicated at the same time. I went because part of me hoped he might be there. I parked across the street, one hand still resting on the steering wheel even after the engine went quiet. The windows were fogging, slightly from the sudden drop in temperature, and for a moment, I just sat there, staring through the haze toward the familiar awning with its slightly crooked lettering and always half-lit, open sign. I didn't intend to stay long. I certainly didn't expect what I saw next. Mark walked out of the bakery with a coffee in one hand and a pastry bag in the other, his face turned toward the woman beside him. I saw them before they saw me, if they saw me at all. They were laughing at something, and it wasn't forced or restrained. It was real laughter, the kind that comes easily between people who don't need to explain themselves. And that's when I saw her clearly. Lauren. She wasn't touching him, not directly, but she was close enough that she didn't need to. Her posture was relaxed in a way I recognized too well, the way someone leans into familiarity without thinking about it. He said something that made her laugh harder, and she tossed her hair back in that effortless way of hers, her body tilted toward him as though the rest of the world didn't exist. It was so casual, so practiced, that I knew in an instant this wasn't new. They just kept walking down the sidewalk like it was any other day. I stayed frozen behind the wheel, the bakery bag still empty in my lap, the noise of passing cars muted, under the weight of what I was seeing. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. What I felt in that moment wasn't shock. It was recognition. Everything that had felt rare now felt rehearsed. The conversations, the looks, the careful pauses between words. They were not mine alone. I hadn't been chosen. I had simply been next. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't call out. I didn't take a picture or follow them or even cry. I just sat there perfectly still, watching as what I thought was a thread between two people unraveled into something messier and far more familiar. I watched until they turned the corner and disappeared. The drive home was quiet. No music, no calls, no distractions. Just the faint sound of the tires against the road and the loud, growing awareness that I had misread the entire thing. I didn't feel jealousy. Not exactly. It was more like embarrassment, that quiet, private sting that comes from realizing you've given weight to something that was never designed to hold any. I had believed it was different because I needed it to be. I had wanted to be seen so badly that I hadn't noticed I was standing in line behind others who had already been where I stood. Later that evening, I opened the kitchen drawer to look for a pen and found one of those little notepads Lauren had left behind after helping organize the school auction. Her handwriting was still on the top page, a to-do list in her familiar loopy script, and I stared at it like it was a relic. From a version of reality I hadn't questioned until now. There was no confrontation, no dramatic reveal, just the quiet knowledge that something I'd believed had meaning was nothing more than routine for someone else. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else could have. It was a Sunday evening, the kind that moves too slowly, where the weight of the week ahead starts creeping in before the last light has left the sky, and the sound of the dishwasher in the background becomes the only rhythm in a house full of unsaid things. I was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables. I didn't feel like cooking, the cutting board damp under my palms, when Josh walked in holding my phone. He didn't say anything at first, no questions, no accusations, not even a pointed silence. Just stood there in the doorway for a moment, looking at the screen like it had offered him something he hadn't even been looking for. When he finally turned it toward me, I saw the message before he spoke. It was from Mark. A line pulled out of our earlier conversation, a message I had forgotten to delete, or maybe hadn't wanted to. The words on the screen weren't graphic, not even romantic, but they didn't need to be. They read, "Sometimes it takes stepping outside the template to remember who you are." That was all. No names, no confessions, just a single line that didn't belong in a marriage built on years of polite assumptions and unspoken rules. Josh didn't speak right away, just watched my face the way someone might study the sky before a storm. Not sure if what they're seeing is real or imagined. I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't try to explain. There was nothing to clarify that would make the message less true or less revealing. He didn't ask me who the message was from. He didn't need to. His eyes were calm, but there was something hollow in them. Not rage, not grief, just the kind of stillness that comes after you've stopped looking for a different answer. He placed the phone on the kitchen counter, carefully, like it was fragile or sacred or toxic, and then stepped back without a word. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice or ask a single question. Instead, he said, "I'm going for a run," and walked out the door in that same steady way he always did, keys in his hand, headphones already unspooling from his jacket pocket. I stood, alone at the kitchen island, one hand still resting on the half-sliced zucchini, the other slightly shaking, though not from fear. It was the kind of shaking that happens when the truth finally arrives without a disguise. In the silence that followed, I stared at the phone on the counter, still lit up, waiting for a reply I would never send. Later that night, he came home, his shirt damp with sweat, his breathing steady, his face blank. We didn't talk about the message. We didn't mention the phone or the look he had given me or the run that had lasted longer than usual. Instead, he told me that he'd finalized the paperwork for the promotion, that everything was moving forward faster than expected, and that Mark had personally signed off on all of it. He said this while drinking water from the bottle I always refilled and left in the fridge for him without thinking. I nodded slowly and murmured something like, "That's good," though the words felt thin and irrelevant. It was like we were acting out a script that no longer fit the characters we had become. He didn't ask me if I had feelings for Mark, and I didn't offer any context. I think in that moment, we both understood that the message itself wasn't the betrayal. It was the symptom. The betrayal had started long before either of us noticed, back when we first stopped asking each other what we wanted outside the margins of our routine. The real fracture had happened slowly, over years of half-listening and polite compromise, and by the time the message showed up, the damage had already settled in like mold behind the walls, invisible, but rotting everything underneath. Hisio went upstairs first, and I followed 20 minutes later. each of us walking the same steps we'd taken for years, but no longer meeting in the same room. I passed by the mirror on the hallway wall and caught a glimpse of myself. Not a stranger, not quite, but someone I hadn't looked at honestly in a very long time. There were no slammed doors that night. No final words. Just the quiet of two people who had run out of ways to keep pretending. The invitation came cloaked in professionalism, a calendar request from Mark's assistant for a midday meeting at a co-working space on the east side of town, where the walls were made of glass and the lighting was always slightly too bright. It was related to a community project we'd both been loosely involved in, a collaboration born months ago out of some half-serious idea we tossed around back when the lines between personal and professional were still faint enough to ignore. There was no message from him directly, no follow-up text, no hidden meaning in the subject line. Just a time, a location, and a list of agenda points so neatly worded, it almost made me believe that nothing unscripted had ever passed between us. I arrived 5 minutes early and found him already there, seated at a high table with a notebook open in front of him and a pen resting between his fingers. He looked calm, maybe even bored, like he'd been thinking about something completely unrelated before I walked in. His posture was loose, his shirt sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms, and there was none of the electricity from that last morning in the park, none of the stillness charged with possibility. As I approached, he stood and nodded once, then gestured for me to sit, like we were colleagues meeting to review logistics before a deadline. I sat across from him, my hands resting lightly on the table, and neither of us reached for a handshake or a smile. We went through the agenda first. He spoke clearly, without hesitation, pausing only to jot down a note or to clarify a number. I answered when necessary, kept my voice steady, and matched his professionalism point for point. For a moment, it felt like we were two entirely different people than the ones who had stood beneath the trees a few weeks earlier, when the air between us had been thick with the weight of everything unsaid. Now it was all formality, sharp edges and clean lines, like we were trying to erase what had happened by proving we could function without it. When the meeting wrapped, neither of us moved to leave. He closed the notebook slowly, placed the pen across the top, and looked at me, not coldly, not kindly, just with a kind of final clarity that made it impossible to pretend anymore. "You knew what this was," he said, not as a question and not as a warning. It wasn't cruel, and it wasn't apologetic. It was just a fact. A sentence placed gently on the table between us, like a paperweight meant to keep the rest of the truth from slipping away. I held his gaze for a moment and then nodded, not because I agreed entirely, but because there was no point arguing with a version of the story that had always been true for him. I had walked into it knowing what I was doing. I had allowed myself to believe in the softness of it, the way it made me feel seen, the way it gave shape to parts of me that had gone unspoken for too long. But I had also known there was no destination here, only a detour. He didn't say we should stay in touch. He didn't suggest we revisit the project again down the line. He didn't ask if I was okay, or if Josh knew, or if I would ever tell him. He didn't offer comfort or distance or closure. He didn't need to. We both understood something now that we hadn't said out loud until this moment, that what happened between us was not an affair of passion or love or escape, but a mirror. He had reflected something back to me I had stopped seeing in myself, and I had done the same for him, briefly, carelessly, honestly. That was all it was. A moment. Not a mistake, not a promise. Just a fleeting collision of two people who had stopped recognizing their own lives. I stood first. There was no hug, no awkward goodbye, no lingering glance. I walked out of the room and into the elevator, pressing the button with a kind of finality I could feel all the way down to the soles of my shoes. Outside, the city noise rushed back in, indifferent and loud, the traffic already building as the lunch crowd spilled onto the sidewalks. I didn't look back at the building. I didn't check to see if he was watching. I didn't rehearse the moment or reshape it in my head. I just walked to my car and drove home, knowing that whatever it had been, whatever we had allowed ourselves to believe for a few suspended weeks, was over. And that, in the end, it had never really belonged to either of us. In the weeks that followed, nothing exploded. No suitcases by the door, no midnight arguments, no sudden declarations of regret. Josh and I continued to live in the same house, sleep in the same bed, and exchange the same rhythms of daily life that had once made us feel like a team. The dishwasher still ran at night. The mail still arrived just after noon. The dog still barked when the neighbor's cat wandered too close to the yard. On the surface, everything remained intact, but underneath, the foundation had shifted. Not enough to collapse the structure, but enough to make every step feel slightly off, like walking through a room where the furniture had been moved just far enough to trip you if you weren't paying attention. We spoke less, though not with bitterness or resentment. It was more like we had both run out of things to say that weren't small or transactional. "We're out of milk. Did you see that email from the school? I'll be late Thursday. Board meeting." It became a quiet choreography of avoidance, of brushing past each other in the hallway with polite nods and the occasional half-smile offered more from habit than emotion. We had become two people performing the memory of a marriage, like actors still showing up for rehearsals long after the audience had stopped coming. He never brought up the message again, never asked about Mark, never followed up on the things. He must have already pieced together. I think he knew there was no point in asking questions he already had the answers to, just like I knew there was nothing I could say that would rewrite the version of me he now carried around in his head. Some people fight for the truth, others learn to live without it. We, it turned out, had chosen the latter. One morning, about 3 weeks after that final meeting with Mark, I found a postcard in the mail. Thick cream paper, no return address, just a small logo in the corner and a line of text across the middle. Suite 302, 117 Ridgeway. It was the new address of his office. That was all. No message, no signature, no explanation. Just a place. A door I could walk through if I chose to. I stood at the counter with it in my hand for a long time, the paper warm from the sun and slightly curled at the edges. Then I dropped it into the trash without flipping it over, pressing it down between a grocery store flyer and a crumpled to-do list I no longer needed. I didn't do it with anger or drama. I wasn't making a statement. I just knew that keeping it would be giving something back to a moment that had already passed, and I didn't want to give it anything else. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table after Josh had gone upstairs, the overhead light flickering slightly, like it always did when the dishwasher ran. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant, or devastated, or even particularly sad. What I felt was harder to define, a kind of dense stillness, like I was surrounded by fog, aware of my own breathing in a way that felt unfamiliar. I had always assumed endings came with declarations or tears or slammed doors. I hadn't known they could come like this. Slowly, quietly, through absence instead of noise. The truth was, I wasn't alone. I had myself. But somehow that felt heavier than any solitude I'd ever imagined. Being alone meant nothing when you had the idea of someone waiting for you on the other side of the door. Being left with yourself, after the noise, after the heat, after the lies and small betrayals, that was something else entirely. That was not freedom. That was reckoning. I realized then that this wasn't the kind of ending people tell stories about. There was no final blow, no defining argument, no broken glass on the floor. The ending had been a slow unraveling, one neither of us had tried to stop. It wasn't a rupture, it was a fading. And in some ways, that was harder. Because it meant we hadn't failed in a dramatic, fiery way. We had simply stopped trying.